Me and Jack, we're going to address that alongside other topics right after this.
Let's go get him. Let's go get him today, man. Let's go. Hey, dominate on 3. 1, 2, 3. Dominate.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to a weekly Friday show here with Jack Hammer, our special guest today. How you doing, Jack?
I'm good. How are you doing, Rohan?
I'm good. Excited to talk to you here on this Friday as the NFL Draft Combine comes along. You know, it's getting from that dead part of the offseason to slowly picking up before the draft. You know what I mean? Because Draft Combine is next week. After that, it's 2 weeks to free agency. After that, you get a bunch of free agency stuff. You go on a little period, and then it's the NFL draft. So a lot of different talking.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot. We have, like you said, you got the combine, free agency, draft, and then after the draft, that's when you start to get OTAs are kind of starting to happen around that time, but you start to get on the field work after the draft, and that leads you right up until the summertime, and then you get a little break there for about a month and a half. That becomes a dead period, but there'll be stuff going on all the way up until about sometime around mid-June, I think, and then things will shut down for about a month and a half.
Yeah, no, I agree there. I definitely agree there. And kind of to kick it off, because we're talking about this offseason talk, and there are a lot of different topics, but one of the ones I wanted to talk about, we've heard a couple of times in this past week, cut candidates, right? The Tennessee Titans were one. They cut 3 players, freeing up $29 million. I mean, we've seen a couple of different cuts, Derek Carr being the biggest one of any team. Do you think there are any cut candidates for the 49ers?
You know, I look at their salary cap situation, and I don't think there's anybody that they can release to. They're not in a position, I guess, like Tennessee or some of these other teams where they're cutting guys to free cap space. The majority of their cap is taken up by guys they want around, and so for them to free up cap space, it's going to be through restructures. And there's 6 guys who they could go to and clear up about $60 million in cap space. So they're not going to do it through cuts. It'll be through restructures. I think you're probably bringing that up because of Javon Kinlaw. You know, It's a name that I've seen a lot. 49er fans are just upset with Javon Kinlaw in general because he was a 13th pick in the draft, or 14th, whatever the number was right there. He's a top draft pick, and they got him to replace DeForest Buckner, who was an All-Pro the following year and a guy that was always productive. And you don't get that. You're not getting that with Javon Kinlaw. And so people are like, hey, let's get rid of him. But it doesn't do you any good to do that at this point. You save nothing against your cap by doing that. So you keep him around. You give him one more year, and you see if he can improve. And if he can't, then you move off of him maybe next year or trade. But I think you run through one more season with Javon Kinlaw.
I think that's smart. And I mean, when we talk about cut candidates, right? You're looking for the players that can free up the most money. And of the players the 49ers have on their roster, I don't know if it makes sense that they really utilize it. Like, if you talk about players that free up the most money, it's players that make maybe $2 million a year, right? I think of the logical candidates, Oren Burks is probably the guy who you might see, and he only saves $1.7 million. You still lose $1 million in dead cap, and it doesn't make sense to probably cut him, given his contributions on special teams, and that you sign him for 2 full seasons, right? I agree with you there. And yeah, my question was more so directed because of guys like Javon Kinlaw, because a lot of people have advocated for releasing Javon Kinlaw. I just don't think that that's the most logical solution. The 49ers, last year of his deal, you don't save anything if you cut him. You can only save if you trade him. Potentially, you save 2.2 or 2.7 million or so. I don't think that there's going to be a trade partner for Javon Kinlaw. And on top of that, the only way that I see the 49ers cutting him is if he can't be one of the best 10 defensive linemen on the team. If you can't crack the top 10, I don't mind it, because then it's just like I don't think that there's a value in keeping him if there's a guy you're going to pay $1 million to that you might keep on the roster. But him not being one of the top 10 defensive linemen on the team, top 10, I think that that's going to be. I don't think that that's going to be the situation. I don't know if he starts next year. I don't know if I'd bet that he would. I think that there are a couple of intriguing candidates to do so, but regardless, I don't think that he gets cut. It doesn't save the 49ers money, and the only time that I could envision him getting cut is in August if he doesn't make the team on training camp.
Yeah, I think you put it right there. If he's one of the top 10, he's going to make the roster. They're not going to have 10 guys better than Javon Kinlaw on this roster. It's just not going to happen. He's going to be there. Whether he starts or not, that's a different story. But he's going to be on the roster, and he can help them out, whether he's a spot player or starter. We'll see what he becomes and what he can do. We talk a lot about guys with potential. Yeah, there was a reason why the 49ers took him where they took him, because they thought he had the potential to be the player. So
Right.
if we're going to give players the benefit of the doubt based on potential, let's do it with Javon Kinlaw too.
No, you're right. And I mean, with the way the 49ers have their contracts kind of structured, you have a lot of big paying contracts and then a lot of really cheap contracts. That's kind of how it is, right? I mean, Trent Williams, Ark Armstead, Fred Warner, Nick Bosa, Charvarius Ward now, McCaffrey even on his current deal, Deebo Samuel. All of those guys are getting top of the line money. Kyle Juszczyk even at his position, top of the line money. Then when you talk about the second level of players, it's players on their rookie contracts or players not making much money. The only guy who might be the outlier is Dre Greenlaw. And I mean, he's a good player. He makes $9 million. He's a good player. So it is tough, right, to say, because you don't have aging players really on this team. The reason the 49ers did the things that they did last offseason is to get younger. Get more team control under players and to get younger. You don't have these veterans that are getting paid too much money and need to be cut. No, the 49ers have a roster where they have two clear kind of groups. A clear group where the top of the line money, and a clear group where it's whatever you want to call it, just players making cheaper money.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's the lower price deals. And you look at the contracts, like you said, that are out there, and 49ers do a really good job of creating when they give these big deals to these players. They give themselves with their structuring, the way they put them together, they tend to give themselves the ability to come back and do restructures and those kind of things. So you talk like Deebo Samuel, he got near top of the wide receiver market money, but he's only going to count $8.6 million against the cap this year. Dre Greenlaw, big deal last year, he's only going to be 5.5. You give these guys time, they can restructure their contracts. You look at like a guy like Charvarius Ward, $16.4 million cap hit this year, but only 2.4 in bonus money. There's $11 million there between his base salary and his bonus. There's money to be worked with here. So if the 49ers want to get a guy, or they want to bring somebody back, they have mechanisms in place to make that happen.
No, I do agree. And I think that right now, 49ers, they should probably feel pretty comfortable. They do likely need to utilize some of those mechanisms to free up some cap space. Just don't think cutting is likely the way that they do so. But moving forward, kind of staying in a way on personnel. Franchise tag. The 49ers, they haven't been a team that utilizes the franchise tag much. I believe the last time they did so was on a kicker. Robbie Gould in the 2019 season. They franchise tagged him, paid him about $5 million that year before extending him. Gould now is a free agent at age 41, I believe. And let's be honest, Robbie Gould is not a guy who's going to kick you 55-yard field goals. No, he's a guy who operates within the 50-yard marker, but is pretty functional. He is the best postseason kicker in history. He's made, I think it's 28 or 29 field goals in a row in the postseason. He's 29 for 29. So he can get it to you when you need it, and he can kick well within 50 yards. But do you think that the franchise tag should be used this offseason on a player? And if so, should it be used on Gould?
Yeah, just, looking at the numbers there for franchise tags and so on, there's nobody on the Fernandez roster as far as the guys that are coming up where you're going to want to franchise tag them. And that includes a guy like Mike McGlinchey. So no, I don't think so. I think the franchise tag is like basically if you're stuck and you're not able to negotiate with a player, or they're just basically not giving you an option. I think that's why they had to use the franchise tag on Gould when they did. if there's a player that would get it again this year, that's who it would be on. The numbers aren't that expensive there. 5.4 million, I believe it is, for the kicker franchise tag. So, if they're going to utilize it, it's going to be on Robbie Gould, nobody else.
I think it's interesting, right? You talk about a point that I like the point that you brought up with Mike McGlinchey, how they're not going to. The way the 49ers operate and the way most NFL teams operate and why the franchise tag isn't necessarily the most valuable thing is because when you have extensions, teams like to utilize that first year as a low cap hit. They don't want to have a cap hit of what the franchise tag would be. The franchise tag is going to be the average annual value or something like that of the deal. So if McGlinchey is going to get paid $14 million on the franchise tag, he might get maybe a 4-year, $60 million deal. But he's not making $15 million in year one on a cap hit. Instead, he's making maybe $5 million in year one. The 49ers, they like to do that. They like to keep the first few years low, not pay too much upfront money, but instead backload the contracts because the NFL continues to rise in terms of its salary cap. And if you utilize the franchise tag, it unfortunately doesn't allow you to do so. This year, I don't believe they're going to use it. Like you said, Robbie Gould is likely the likeliest candidate for that to happen. But to pay $5 million, especially when you've had a philosophy recently of trying to get younger, to pay $5 million more for a kicker in an offseason where you likely can draft a kicker, I think I don't know if it's the best resources. It's a tough case because Gould is really good at what he does. He's limited, but he's very good at what he does. And so it is a tough case for sure. I just think the price might be too steep. And also, you don't know if Gould wants to stay here in San Francisco or if he wants to go back near where his family's been in Chicago.
Well, right. That's why you would use the franchise tag, though, right? Is to force him not to be able to go out to Chicago. And with Gould, you're right. I mean, he's limited to under 50. I mean, he can maybe hit 50 if there's a good win behind him or what have you. But for the most part, he's under 50. But he's also money in the playoffs. So if you're expecting to make the playoff run, if you're expecting to be a team that's going to be contending for getting to the Super Bowl, I think you go in that direction and you take the risk there to bring him in. I'd rather have Robbie Gould kicking for me in 2023 than somebody from the draft. We've seen there's a lot of examples of kickers who were expected to be really good in the pros who were drafted and flamed out. So go with a guy who, especially at a position like that, who can get the job done over somebody who you hope. We're not talking about a right tackle again, kind of a player. We're talking about a guy who scores points for you, and it's important to make sure those guys are making the plays when called upon.
No, I do agree. But transitioning a little bit here, We've talked about cut candidates. We've talked about the franchise tag. I want to bring up another key personnel decision. And I think it's one where we've talked about briefly before, but I want to get your opinion. Drafting a quarterback. 49ers, they've drafted one in the past 2 years. Worked out pretty well last year with Brock Purdy. What's your take on this situation?
I think that they have to draft it. I mean, the injury to Brock Purdy and we don't know what's going to happen there. So they're stuck in a way. I mean, think of it this way for right now. Right at this moment, the 49ers do not have an active quarterback that is signed for 2023 that is healthy. Lance is injured still. He's not cleared yet. Purdy, we don't know when he's going to be cleared. They're going into the offseason program that's going to start up, I think it's in April. The on-field work, though, starts around May after the draft. So you get into it. They're going to have to bring in a guy. They're going to have to bring in guys in a couple different ways. I think they have to bring in at least one veteran quarterback. And I'm with you. I'd go ahead and draft a quarterback. With the way the salary cap is right now, I think you draft a quarterback every year, because unless you have a guy like Patrick Mahomes, why would you spend $40 million on Daniel Jones to be your quarterback? Patrick Mahomes is somebody you pay the money for. Why would you give a middle of the road quarterback that kind of money? That's where your franchise gets screwed up. And so you keep bringing these guys in and let them fight for it. Using a mid to late round draft pick on a quarterback who's been around the college game for 4 years. We saw how that worked out for the 49ers last year. It makes a lot of sense.
I think it's a very intriguing topic because you bring up really good points. The only other thing I'll say is the 49ers have two quarterbacks they already know that they're going to use on their 53-man roster. The max teams normally carry is 3 quarterbacks, and I think that when you talk about the quarterbacks, if you're going to add one in free agency, and I think that that's gonna be the most telling move, who they add. But if they add a very serviceable backup in free agency for $3-4 million, maybe a Taylor Heineke, then that quarterback is likely going to be the 3rd quarterback on the active roster, whereas whoever you draft potentially gets cut and puts on the practice squad. I'm of the idea to draft a quarterback. I think it's smart to draft quarterbacks, especially the one like for the exact reasons you just said. Experienced guys that you know can operate within the game, that you can enhance, especially in this system. Shanahan showed that he could do it with his staff, with Brock Purdy this past year. And I don't know if there's going to be a quarterback in the 7th round with the talent that Brock Purdy had last year, because I thought he should have been drafted earlier. It was just a deep class. But in general, I think it's smart too. The only thing is, I would do it if you understand that you're going to likely cut that quarterback and end up being on the him being on the practice squad. That's why I wouldn't spend a mid-round pick on a quarterback. I know a lot of people are talking about Jake Haener from Fresno State, and I think he's a good quarterback. He might even be quarterback 5 in this class behind the top 4. I just don't think that if you cut him, that another team won't claim him, and that's why I don't know how high it would be. Now, if the 49ers sign maybe a Nate Sudfeld type of quarterback in free agency, I'm all for it, because you understand that you likely can cut him and get away with the losses if there are any in terms of guaranteed money, and you could roll with your 3 quarterbacks. And a point that I believe you brought up last week, 49ers have a veteran, Ryan Greasy. He's a guy who's played the position. He's a veteran in the room. And so I think that that's really valuable, and don't necessarily need a 30-year-old quarterback or a 28-year-old quarterback in the room. And that's where you can go ahead and draft a guy. I think that you could definitely do it. It's just, what is their outlook? Do they want the guy who has NFL experience, and do they value that NFL experience, in which they might sign a guy like Taylor Heineke and spend a little more money, or are they willing to go cheap, trust that they have their 2 guys, and then end up drafting a rookie quarterback who could potentially make the roster as number 3?
Yeah, well, you look at we can talk about this in a bunch of different ways. We can talk about the quarterbacks. It's like a guy like Jake Haener in the 5th round. If he's available for the 49ers in the 5th round, go get him. If he's not available, go after Max Duggan, who is from TCU, who was a 4-year player there, a lot of throws in college, kind of has a similar background to Purdy in terms of the length of time that he's been playing. Maybe not as many throws, but it's still a pretty good amount of them. There's a number of guys there that we can take a look at there. I do think they need to bring a veteran in. Now, the veteran that they do sign isn't going to be – I think that's where people need to kind of reel it back, because I see a lot of these coming out. I know I put one out earlier today, and it had the only guy who was really somebody that would cost some money, I think, was Baker Mayfield. Now, I also made sure that I clarified at the end of that with Mayfield, there's a lot of things that play into that, because there's also, you got to take into account the relationship with Nick Bosa and stuff like that. So you might not go in that direction, but the other quarterbacks on that list were all $3 million or less. So if you're looking at a veteran, you're looking at a guy who could step in and be a starter, but you're not going to go after one of those guys that's a starter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I agree. I do agree. And I think that that's a good point. Talking about the veterans, see a comment here: when Matt Ryan gets cut, get him. Would he be one of the ones that you consider? I didn't see your list. I don't know exactly who you had in mind. Would he be, though, one of the guys you'd consider?
The reason that you'd be interested, I didn't have Matt Ryan there. I think the reason that you might want to bring him in is because of the experience that he has with Kyle Shanahan, and he can step in and knows the offense already. There's no learning curve for him. But I didn't include him. The guys that I had, I had Mayfield, and then I also had Jacoby Brissett was on that list. The other guys that I picked other than that were guys who, for the most part, do a pretty good job of holding on to the ball. So Jacoby Brissett, he's about 1.5, I think it was 1.5% interception rate. And so that's kind of what we saw it play out with the 49ers this year, right? When Jimmy Garoppolo and Brock Purdy were playing and they weren't turning the ball over, this team was at their best. So you bring in a guy like Jacoby Brissett, he's been around the league for a while. He's had some success, some struggles, but he's never really been in a position like what he'd be in here. I think he'd be okay. Andy Dalton is somebody the 49ers have already shown in the past to be interested in. They were looking at getting him in 2021, but he chose to go to Chicago because Jimmy Garoppolo was still on the roster. And, with Lance coming in, I don't think he was told he was going to be the starter. I think he was given the impression by Chicago that he was going to be number one. He was going to be the starter. It only lasted 2 weeks, but I think, that's what they told him. But the other two are guys who are not as well known. Jarrett Stidham, 49er fans know because the Raiders almost beat the Raiders. I liked his athleticism. I liked his ability to throw the ball. He made some really nice throws against the 49ers. Even the following week against the Chiefs, there was a couple. I was at that game, the game against the Chiefs. There were some really nice throws there too. Some struggles as well, but that's kind of to be expected. And then the other one, I don't know if I can't. John. It's the guy that was the quarterback for the Rams.
John Wolford.
John Wolford. Thank you. I keep wanting to use an S to start his last name. That's why I couldn't remember it. So yeah, John Wolford. That's a name that makes sense to me. Again, Wolford doesn't come in. Wolford is like if they bring in Wolford, think of him as Nate Sudfeld kind of a signing, a guy who's been around the league, who can kind of execute the offense a little bit, but you don't really expect him to. He's not going to compete with anybody in terms of pushing them at all. He's just a guy who you can sign on a low end deal, who should be able to operate the offense better than what we saw in the NFC Championship game if called upon.
I think that those are some really cool options that you bring up. The guys I know I brought up a couple of weeks ago, I believe I put Taylor Heineke in there, Brissett I put in there, and a couple of those names. Like you said, though, you do have to be realistic about the players that you do sign. And for a guy like Brissett, the caveat is he's going to be expensive. He's going to probably cost around at least $8 million per year. And I think the 49ers understand that they are, in a way, a little limited in terms of the salary cap. So I think that that's a situation that you have to talk about. A guy like Heineke I like because I think he has the aggressiveness to throw downfield, probably a little more than you'd want. But, I mean, that's something Kyle Shanahan covets, and he fits what you want in a quarterback in terms of the leadership. And so I think that he could be a valuable asset. But I do think that they need to sign a veteran quarterback. To what degree and who that is, that'd be interesting. I'd shy away from Matt Ryan. I think that while the familiarity in the scheme is important and certainly helpful, I just don't know that I'd go with a guy who I don't believe has that much talent right now. Matt Ryan doesn't necessarily fit in terms of the mobility. Both Brock Purdy and Trey Lance have better mobility than him and have the ability to move around the pocket. And the arm strength right now for Matt Ryan, I'm not sure it's necessarily there. I mean, we've seen him unfortunately fall off a little bit during his time in Indianapolis this past year. I don't know how talented right now he is.
Yeah, I think you just really hit on it. That's why I'm just not excited about. There's nothing about Matt Ryan that gets me excited when it comes to having him play quarterback for the 49ers. He all the reasons why. So if that's the only name that's out there, if he's the last man standing, he's the only option, then I guess so. But other than that, there's got to be something else that you can bring in that's going to help you out more.
Right, exactly. We have an interesting question here. I don't know if you've watched enough, but I do want to ask you about him and the 49ers. Ricky here asks, where do you think Hendon Hooker will go in the draft? For those of you who don't know, Hendon Hooker, Tennessee quarterback, tore his ACL in November, was looking like one of the better quarterbacks in the class, potentially behind the top 4 right there. Right now, ACL. What do you think about drafting him and his talent, especially because he might fall a little more than you'd expect in this draft?
I'm not good about this because I'm not paying attention to guys that the 49ers aren't going to be involved with. I just don't have the bandwidth to do it. So I haven't really dug into, I can't give a good idea on this. I know that there's a lot of people that are really high on Hooker, and he's not going to be with the 49ers. So unfortunately, I'm sorry, I can't give you a whole lot to it. I have to lean on Rohan there to pick me up.
Yeah, and I mean, when you talk about Hendon Hooker, he's a talented quarterback. There are a couple of issues though. He like the talent itself should likely land him in the mid rounds. But you talk about, first of all, his age. He's 25 years old already, which does scare NFL teams, if we're being honest. And then the number 2 is the injury. For me, I want a quarterback that can play this offseason. The 49ers, they have enough injured quarterbacks. Brock Purdy is not going to play for potentially the entire offseason, maybe not even in the preseason. We don't know, depending on how his timeline will go. Trey Lance will play, but he will be cleared by the time OTAs come. But you have one quarterback healthy on your roster right now. You need at least 2 more bodies in the offseason that can play. And so to me, Hendon Hooker is a guy who will likely not be ready until at least week 1 of the regular season. While the talent is there, I don't know how valuable it is for the 49ers in the short term to draft a quarterback and then have to sign 2 more guys, understanding that Hooker will not play. He won't be ready come week 1. So you have to get 2 more bodies in there. And then after that, if you want to keep Hooker on the 53-man roster, you're going to cut the 2 guys that you brought in and bring in a guy who hasn't had any experience, any practice reps at all in your system to be your third stringer. So to me, I think that the logic behind it's a little hazy. I like the player. I just don't know if the fit is there because the 49ers, if they're going to want to draft a guy, I think they'd prefer he gets reps the entire offseason. And because they want bodies, you're essentially using a 90-man roster spot on a quarterback that you know is not going to play.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think when you look at it and you talk about it that way, not just with Hendon Hooker, but just the quarterback position in general, with where the 49ers are right now, it might be a little tough for them to get these guys in. Even the names that I mentioned, those, especially the veteran of those guys, it might be tough because you're looking at, as somebody, think about this as a quarterback who's coming in. That they're highly invested in Trey Lance in terms of draft capital, those types of things. All signs point to them really, still being bought in on what Lance can do. They really also like Brock Purdy. Purdy's going to be on this roster at some point, maybe not week 1, but who knows at this point? We don't know, but he's going to be there at some point. So do you want to invest yourself in coming in here to be the number 3 guy, for an opportunity to be number 3? You might have a chance to be the backup, start a couple of games, but as far as, long-term for the season, be number 3, that's, I think, where when you look at the potential guys for them to sign, it gets really tricky and they're in a tight spot. I said that a couple of days ago. People, pushed back on that thinking that it was silly, but it really is the case. It's, and I'm talking about folks over here on the YouTube responses that I had after I mentioned it, because it is tough in terms of if you're a player, why would you give yourself up for a team that you don't
play
have
you really?
Exactly, especially if you're somebody that can play, again, like a Jacoby Brissett or any of those names that we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right in this, and that's also part of the reason that influenced my thinking into Taylor Heinicke, because he's the only quarterback that on record has said, I'm okay with being a backup quarterback. I understand my role. I'm okay with being a backup quarterback because I understand it's an easier job. It's one of the easier jobs in the NFL because you're essentially getting paid $2-3 million at least to not play. And that's how it is. And so it is tough because everybody in the NFL wants a chance to play. They want to compete. They want to earn money and compete so that they can earn more money later on. But when it comes to the 49ers, you're going to have to be relegated to the fact that, guess what? You're not going to play, likely. They've got 2 young guys that they really like, and regardless of how the offseason goes, they're going to resort to those 2 young guys. I mean, that's just how it is. They believe they have 2 starting quarterbacks, and so when you factor everything in together with the money that they're likely willing to shell out, understanding they have 2 guys they're comfortable with, and other players might not want to come here because of that issue, then it narrows down the pool to some of the different options that you have. Like maybe it is a guy like Nate Sudfeld or Nick Mullins or whoever it is, right? Maybe it's one of those guys. But yeah, that's definitely something and a very, very underrated part of this entire equation.
Yeah, for sure.
But moving forward, we talked about the quarterbacks. I want to talk about this next draft topic because it's the headline. It's the most important one. Right tackle. We talked about Mike McCarthy last week. We talked about free agency. Agree that it likely ends up being a departure for Mike McGlinchey. Do you think that the 49ers should trade up for a right tackle in this draft in 2023?
I think that if there's a player that the 49ers like that's in late round 1, round 2, wherever it is, where they can trade up with use some of their draft capital because they have a number of picks to trade up for, whether it is a right tackle or any position, safety. Maybe they want to get a free safety. Maybe they want a DB. Those are some other spots that they have needs. Maybe they're going to go after a defensive tackle. Do it. You have plenty of draft capital. instead of bringing in 10 guys who may or may not make your team, go out there and get 7 that you feel are really going to be able to stick with your roster and be built upon, because they have a very strong core of players, and they have a number of these guys that they drafted last year. They always kind of seem to be drafting for future years. But if you can make a trade up to round 3 or round 2, use those third round picks and get up into somewhere around 2 for one of those top level right tackles, by all means, go ahead and do it.
I agree with you here. And I mean, when you talk about the right tackle position, it's an important position for sure, right? And I mean, for the 49ers, it's going to be important because at the moment, it looks like Colton McKivitz is going to be your guy, right? It looks like the 49ers are going to roll into the offseason, understand Colton McKivitz is a starter. And so to me, I think that when you talk about that, when you highlight that fact, right? You want competition. The 49ers love competition. And I think it's important to also understand what you might have for the future, because the only way to really see if Colton McKivitz could potentially even be the guy for the future is having him compete with an option that you believe can also compete at that position. Fortunately, the reality is Jalen Moore isn't that guy. He's likely a better guard. I mean, in my opinion, he's a better guard. That's what I thought he could come into the NFL as. He hasn't looked good in tackle. And to me, I think that they need another option. If Mike McGlinchey isn't going to return, I think you have to go and get your guys. Matthew Bergeron, maybe a couple of guys that are certainly there, certainly capable, but understanding the need for tackle could go earlier in the draft, in the second round, maybe even the early third round. And I think with the draft capital the 49ers have and their current situation with their roster, they should feel fairly comfortable with the depth they have at certain positions and should be able to add in free agency. Important for them, understanding you have the capital this year.
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely some, they have names. And, one of the things that's also interesting with this drafts capital question and the depth that they have and those kind of things is, they have a lot of depth already existing on their roster. So it's going to be interesting to see how much they believe in the depth that they have. Now, Brunskill and Colton McKivitz are free agents. As far as, along with Mike McGlinchey. So those are really all your right tackle candidates. So, what are they going to do there? Do you bring back McKivitz and Brunskill and let them kind of compete for that right tackle spot? And the loser is, a swing guy, or, how are you going to go about that? And even at the center spot, it's the same thing there. Do you bring back Jake Brendel, or do you go with Nick Zakel? Or is it, do you bring back Daniel Brunskill to be your center? I mean, there's these names of the guys that are on the roster, some of these free agents that have to come back and so on. It really creates some interesting discussions. The one thing that's good about it is they don't really have a definite where you can look at the roster and say, well, here, because they don't have a guy to play it other than maybe free safety.
I agree. And I mean, that goes to the point of when you talk about depth. 49ers, the one thing they've done well with this roster is figured out how to insulate depth, understand that they have issues, and they're going to need to highlight those issues. When you talk about a position like left guard, right? They drafted Aaron Banks, understanding Laken Tomlinson was going to leave in free agency with a bigger contract should he perform at the level he was performing at. You talk about center. They had Jake Brendel step in after serving as the backup for the last 2 seasons once Alex Mack retired. I mean, you could talk about different positions, right? I mean, at linebacker right now, the 49ers are going to lose Azeez Al-Shire, and they're likely insulated with a couple of guys who could compete. Marcelino McCrary-Ball, a guy who I was high on since the 49ers picked him up in the undrafted free agent pool. Oren Burks was there. Demetrius Flanagan-Fowles, even if he returns, could be there. You've got a couple of options there for sure. And I mean, I think that you could say that at most positions for the 49ers. So I think, yeah, you're right. You're right about that, where you don't necessarily have a specific hole where you need every single draft pick of those to address all of those holes. You definitely have desires and wants to improve your roster, but there's not necessarily a specific hole where you're looking, yes, we need to go attack that position. Free safety, yes. Free safety, you can argue. And the benefit of the doubt I will give to the 49ers because they have done well at the free safety position. Regardless of who's played, it seems like at safety, they've been able to accomplished enough. I mean, Jaquasi Tart, Jimmy Ward, now Talanoa Hufanga, and Tashawn Gibson. I mean, they've done pretty solid with regardless of the amount of capital they've invested to the position and the amount of money. And so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt there.
Yeah, it's gonna. That's what always makes the offseason so interesting around the 49ers, because we always think that we know what they're going to do, and then usually what happens is they go do something about 180 degrees opposite of what everybody's thinking that they're going to do. Right? You look back last season, and I don't think anybody expected Charvarius Ward to be a guy that was going to be signed by the 49ers, and then they bring him in, and everybody got super excited about it because he had some good numbers for Kansas City. So it makes it difficult to pick that out. But this is a roster. Just to take a step back just for a second. This is a team that is coming off of back-to-back trips to the NFC Championship game.
Right.
It's also a team that's returning 16 of 22 starters. So this is a team that's in a really good spot when you compare it to any other team that's in the NFL. At 16 out of 22 starters returning, that's a big number. Almost all of those guys on offense. I think there's only 2 starters on offense that they're losing. A few more on the defensive side. I can't remember the numbers exactly, but this is a really good roster. I hear people say they need to improve along the offensive line. Well, I guess I thought the offensive line was actually one of the better offensive lines in the league. So it's just about trying to keep. I think really what they're in a position of where they have to do is just to try to maintain the level that they're at. I don't know if they can really improve upon Mike McGlinchey at right tackle, at least this season coming up in 2023. I don't know if they can improve upon what Jake Brendel did at center, next year. I doubt highly that they're going to improve upon what Tashawn Gibson did at safety last year if they don't bring him back. So, the one spot, I think, the biggest spot, I think, that if you want to look at where they can improve upon, it's the guy opposite of Nick Bosa. That's the one thing. You look at the 49ers team, and the biggest area for potential improvement is in the pass rush. Nick Bosa, 18 and a half sacks. The rest of the team only the team as a whole, 44, somewhere right around that number. They need another pass rusher. Eric Armstead, Drake Jackson. What are they going to do? Who else are they going to bring back along that defensive front? I think, we keep talking about the trenches, and I think in reality with the Flyers, the defensive trenches are the bigger upgrade spot potential than what you have on the offensive side.
No, you're right. And I mean, part of it goes to who the 49ers have at the defensive line, but also because you have to understand talent along the defensive line is easier to come along than talent on the offensive line. It's really hard to upgrade it on the offensive line because offensive linemen, you don't necessarily. Mike McGlinchey and Caleb Gary are going to be free agents, but when you talk about the top ones, Trent Williams has never hit the market. Guys I know he's the best one, but like top 5 players or top 8 tenders in the offensive line rarely hit the open market, and when they do, they get overpaid for because that's how offensive line is. Defense, I think it is a little easier because of the players in and out. But like offensive linemen get subbed out in and out when it comes to the run of the pass and things like that. So I think it is a little easier for that situation. But I do think the point you bring up about the offensive line is valuable. I mean, the 49ers had a good offensive line last year, and more likely than on paper to acquire that to where it significantly impacts the roster. And I don't think that it will be. At least from a bird's eye view, without the moves they make, I don't necessarily think that this offensive line is going to significantly regress. Hampers the 4-3.
It looks like Rohan scooted away there for a second. We'll wait for him to come back, but um, I think what he was getting at, it was a little choppy, but I think what what he was saying was, you look at this team, and they have a better chance uh, to improve along the defensive front. The offensive side isn't going to be necessarily one where there's going to be massive improvements if they change up there. I think to change it, I think what he's saying is, you look at this team overall, you look at the options along the offense to improve. The offensive line, McGlinchey, Brendel playing at a pretty decent level. Those are the two guys that you're looking at possibly losing. And while they can maybe not come back, there's other names or other guys that they can pick up, and they've done a pretty good job overall with creating a roster that they can win games. We've seen Kyle Shanahan win games without guys who are really good playing right tackle. So even if they have to take a little bit of a step back there to step forward, eventually it'll work out. I think that's kind of what Rohan was saying, because it was a little choppy there.
Yeah, and I appreciate you carrying afloat while I return. But no, you are right. You are right there, and I think that's an important message to note, right? When you talk about the offensive line and the right tackle position. So to summarize, again, I think that 49ers, if they have their guy, which there are a couple of guys who I think that they're going to be interested in, should look to move up for that right tackle, because it is an integral position, and a position where you can not necessarily upgrade, but find a solution to replace Mike McGlinchey in the future in this draft.
I agree. I mean, if you can find it, go ahead and get it. Trade up if you can, and with an eye towards being better in 24 or 25 for sure.
Yeah. Going back to the quarterback talk, because we got a question. I want to ask you, because you're a guy who calls it straight. You see how it is, and regardless of the opinion, you're going to give your opinion. So who do you think is going to be the starting quarterback for the 49ers in 2023? Is it Brock Purdy or Trey Lance? I know my answer. Curious to hear yours, especially after the recent news with Brock Purdy.
Well, I think when you factor in the recent news here, I think it's going to be Trey Lance. We've been saying all along that Trey Lance is going to get his shot. They're going to give him every opportunity they can to win the job. Yeah. And right now with Brock Purdy's surgery being delayed a little bit, I think that pushes it more towards Trey Lance being your starter. Now, is he going to be the starter of the whole year? That's just going to depend on how well he plays.
I think I agree here. And when you talk about the starting quarterback, to me, here's how I view it. I know everyone's coming in, including myself, with the notion that if it's Brock Purdy's job, I think that that's true. Brock Purdy proved himself last offseason to where if he can showcase that he's healthy and continue the momentum that he had, it's his job to lose. However, it is wrong to assume that an injury doesn't change the quarterback situation. We saw it last year where everyone thought Trey Lance was the guy because he was the guy who entered the season as the starter, and then it ends up being Brock Purdy as the guy because of the way that he played, because he played like the best quarterback last year. And so to me, because of that, I think that Brock Purdy it's his job to lose, but I think Trey Lance is going to get the opportunity to prove that he could be the guy. And ultimately, what Trey Lance does this offseason is going to dictate how the 49ers quarterback situation goes. Because Brock Purdy at the moment is not going to get the chance to likely perform throughout the offseason, which means that Lance's performance is going to be indicative of what the 49ers will do at quarterback. And I think right now he's got to be your starter. And like you said, it's all about Lance. If he can play well enough, he's going to be the starter. If he can't play well enough, then the 49ers might experience a change. But from the way we've seen over the past few seasons, I think that they stay through the ebbs and flows that Lance situation over the past few years. But it's up to him. His performance will likely indicate who ends up being the quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, you said what I've been saying for a while too. If I thought the job going into the Philadelphia game, I thought going at that point, I was of the belief that Brock Purdy was the quarterback that should have the leg up in the quarterback competition going. This offseason, the injury changes all that. we'll see how it turns out. You look at Trey Lance and you watch them on film. Let's just put their film on, and it's pretty clear when you watch the film that there's a rhythm with one that there isn't with the other. Now, does that mean that Trey Lance can't be the guy moving forward? Absolutely not. It just means that so far we haven't seen it yet. There's been some ups and downs in camp and all throughout too. So, it's again, he's a young guy who hasn't played a lot of football. Brock Purdy had played a lot of football before last season, so he kind of had a little bit of a leg up there. Trey Lance just really, quite frankly, doesn't have many snaps, and I don't think really anybody knows. I don't think anybody has any clue what Trey Lance is. The people that are really, really high on him, who are saying he's going to be he has like the really high. I mean, okay, but I mean, other than a guy who can throw the ball long, what else is there to say that to back you up on that?
Right.
I've heard mentioned a couple of times how terrific he is on passes beyond 30 yards. Well, okay, and then you go back and you actually look at how many times he's thrown the ball beyond 30 yards. Well, he's thrown 102 passes in the NFL, and he's thrown 3 that have traveled beyond 30 yards in the air. So that's less than 3% of his total attempts. So, you look at the metrics. That's the reason why PFF has their metric at 20 plus, for their deep passes, because that's the zone where most deep passes go is between 20 to over 20 yards. There's the average, guys, as far as deep shots, it's usually right around 28 to 25 yards is the average. If you look at their average depth of target on deep throws. So, Lance has to improve on that mid to short game. He needs to show that he can get the ball out of his hand quicker and accurately. And we're going to find out all about this with him. I know that Jalen Hurts keeps getting brought up. Jalen Hurts is an interesting case for me because the people who are pushing on Jalen Hurts and how Philadelphia stuck by Jalen Hurts are also the same people who will tell you that the 49ers have screwed this up by using Trey Lance as a runner. Well,
Right.
part of what makes Jalen Hurts so good is his running ability and the threat that he has with the run. And on top of that, he gets the ball out of his hand, and he's really good in the short passing game. He's really good on those throws be under 10 yards. Trey Lance isn't. He's a guy who, Jalen Hurts has completed this last season was around 95% on those underneath throws. That's not anywhere close to what Trey Lance is so far. So we'll see. It's a good point of discussion, but when you actually start to look at the players, they are very different in what they've been able to accomplish.
I agree, and this is why I bring up. I brought up something earlier today on Ryan Hensley's show. I know we have probably a little bit of a different opinion on it. I think that there's a distinct definition between potential and floor. And I think you've got to talk about quarterbacks and really all players with 2 different distinctions. When you talk about potential, you're talking more so about what you believe the player can be. But you also have to analyze the floor. You can't make them together because player is right now. And I think a lot of people get curious when evaluating players, when in reality, their potential is certainly high, but they're not necessarily playing at that level now. It's important to understand the distinction between the 2 categories because there is certainly a distinction. And that's why, while people certainly do see the product, too small of a sample size to really that Lance will get his opportunity after 2 full seasons with really 15 quarters of football played. And so excited to see what happens in the offseason for sure, but still a good amount of questions with both quarterbacks. I personally, I do believe that, though, the solution will be there. I mean, from what I've seen on tape, that's kind of where I'm basing it off of as happens from on out.
I agree. I agree with you there.
Back, I do really appreciate you coming today. I don't know if it's still choppy or not, but I do appreciate you coming on hanging with me here. Unfortunately, this is this day. I much for tuning in, Jack.
No, I always appreciate coming on and having the discussions with you. We agree, we disagree. It's always fun, and the whatever the reason is, maybe you just need to tell your roommate to get off of his computer so that you can get the Wi-Fi to work. Maybe that's what it is. The guy he's downloading something he probably shouldn't be. That's probably what the problem is. So, no, I'm teasing you, but it's always fun to chat with you, and I appreciate you for asking me to come on with you today.
Hey, the whole building. It's the whole. Yes, sir. All of yes, we're gonna be back with content soon. I'm going to a hockey game today for the first time this year, covering a hockey game. So that's how my weekend's gonna end. Hopefully you guys have a great weekend. Jack and I will be back very soon.